This session is all about the new merge frameworks and how we have taken Ext JS from desktop all the way to smartphone. But before we go into the details of how that has been accomplished, let's recap a little bit of the device landscape and the browser landscape and the complexity involved in the evolution of a framework. Just a few years ago, the device market was dominated by the desktop. With the mobile evolution, with the mobile evolution, we are seeing more and more form factors showing up. Smaller screens are dominating the app development. A new UI paradigm is needed to support all of this within the frameworks. On the other end, the browsers, people are still using the legacy browsers like IE7, IE8, especially in the enterprise. Newer browsers have come up lately, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, IE11, that have humongous functionality that you cannot, that cannot compete with the legacy browser. The legacy browser cannot compete with it. It has created a tremendous gap between the functionality that is that is desired by the legacy browsers. In order to achieve the same user experience across the legacy and the modern browsers, there's a lot of programming that is needed. There's a lot of heavy lifting that is required by using JavaScript layouts because the legacy browsers are not supporting HTML5 and CSS3. So as we evolved the two frameworks at Sencha, Ext JS 4 came out for the desktop support. It was a desktop-only framework. Last year, we released Ext JS 5, which added the support for tablet. But at the time, we also carved out a common core, which was our first step towards achieving this unification. On the other end, we have Sencha Touch, which is a mobile-only framework. A lot of you have used Sencha Touch on desktop devices. But the functionality on desktop is questionable because Sencha Touch doesn't support the mouse click events. So with 6, we are unifying the two frameworks, and Don Griffin is going to walk us through how we have accomplished that, with the foundation being Ext JS 5. So I invite Don Griffin to go over that.
So start with a kind of a visual rendering of what is in a framework and what makes our frameworks from kind of the bottom up. So obviously at the very bottom of the framework, we have things like the class system and the loader. Built on top of this, we've got other utilities like the DOM layer, how we manipulate elements, how the components interact with DOM and deal with browser disparities. And then we have a data package of a session entirely dedicated to the data package, so it's a very robust piece of the overall framework. And then we, of course, have application architectures built on top of this that take advantage of routing. They can do view models, view controllers, just general model view controller or MVVM. So a significant amount of code there. Each of these blocks isn't really drawn to scale, but you get the idea. There's a lot of things taking shape under here, and there are a lot of just general purpose utilities as well. And collectively, we just kind of lump all of that together and say this is the core. And of course, there's a huge layer on top, which is the views and the components. And that is where most people think, when they think, JavaScript framework, it's all about the views. Well, that's not exactly fair. There's a lot of code that's not there. So Scott mentioned, historically, for technical reasons, browser reasons, device reasons, Sencha has evolved two separate frameworks. And if you've used both, how many of you have used both Sencha Touch and Ext JS? So majority of folks here have used both, and I could probably agree that they are not the same framework. Even at some of the lower levels, they're not the same. And with Ext 5, we started the process of bringing together these cores so that we're down to a single core that is the reconciled evolution, best in breed of both those frameworks. But with 5, all we had there was the ext side of the views. So with 6, we're bringing these two together into one box. And collectively, these two layers are called a toolkit. So one framework and 2 toolkits. And that's to address the span, the sheer difference between, say, an IE8 that has no CSS3 and a phone which has Flexbox and all kinds of advanced layouts. So we have to take advantage of those things on those devices. We have to support legacy devices. And so the toolkits serve that layer, but it's just at the view layer. Everything else is common, which, of course, makes the stack able to address all devices from desktops down to smartphones. So one of the things, if you've, so how many of you have been around, pre-ext5? You've used ext since before 5. Okay, so how many of you started at 5? So small number of folks. So one of the biggest things taking shape underneath the framework is reorganization of all of the code that makes up the framework and its individual parts. Historically, ext was a source tree or two, and it had a lot of code in that source tree. But over time, to organize all of this, especially when we get to the toolkits, we've had to break up the code into what we call packages, which are large libraries of code. And ext now consists of the core package, 2 toolkit packages, extra utilities and features like charts, user extensions. There are more packages as well. Themes are also packages. So under the covers, there's probably approaching 24 total packages that we use internally just to structure the framework. And this is all fairly transparent if you're using Sencha Command. If you're not, at the end, we'll have a slide or so about how these things can be used more directly. But an awful lot of code motion to deal with the scale. So how many folks have an idea of how large their application is, if they've measured it lines of code or whatnot? Is there metrics that you guys look at occasionally? How big do you think ext all total would be? Is it 100,000 lines, 150,000, 200? Any guesses? Anybody done that? Well, I got asked to do that, so anybody have a number?
182,000.
What's that? 182,000. Yeah, 900,000. Well, oddly enough, you're both basically right. If you take just the core now with ext merged with touch, it's 250,000 lines, and the compiler and command is all about trying to pick the right piece of that you need for your app. But if you total all of the framework, including test infrastructure and everything else, it's upwards of 1 million. So we're designing the framework at scale to deal with applications that run at scale, but at the same time, prune out just what you need for the app that you're trying to build. So the whole idea is this, the idea of a universal framework, the goal is to enable you to build universal applications. So some people build only phone apps, some people only tablet and phone, maybe only desktop, but there are certainly folks that are going to build a single app that wants to span all of those, or somewhere in between. You know, it's a mixture, but we wanted to make sure that you have the tools necessary to do that. So the obvious challenge, if you've built any apps across this divide, is the user experience challenge. And it really boils down to this, that we learned this when phones came out, that desktop user experiences aren't optimal for phones. Don't go there, don't shrink the app down to a tiny thing. You want a whole different experience. But the reverse is equally true. You don't want to take an app designed for a phone and run it on a 27-inch screen that your users are sitting at all day long. They're not going to be happy with that either. So tablets, of course, somewhere in the middle of this. And so the basic idea, we want to give you the tools to create this experience. You have to make some hard choices as you're designing this. And we want to make sure with ext6 that you have all of those tools. So that really boils down to that mission statement there. Give you the tools you need to create amazing experiences for all devices. And so now with 6, that is a reality. So we're going to dive in pretty quick into what an app looks like to us. To us, an app is a page. Now, I guess that's another question. How many of you build applications that span multiple pages? Not one HTML file or JSP file, but many. Is that the majority of them? Okay, so fair number. How many of you have just one entry point, one URL, that's your whole app? Okay, All right, so a universal app, the goal of that is to make sure that that one URL under your control can address all of these devices. And of course, we'll see later down the slides that you can actually pick, I only need this or I only want that. But we're going to look at what's different between what we do today and what is universal. So the biggest thing we're doing is we're just expanding the structure to include toolkit-specific areas and leave behind the ideal areas for sharing code so that you don't have to write your data models or shared resources or styling perhaps. If they can be shared, they can live in the shared area. And if they can't be shared, then you have a space to put that piece. The hope is that sweet spots develop in general around this, where models probably shared, views probably not so shared, resources could be a mix, styling could be a mix, but there's certainly room to have specifics across this, such as why do we have stuff like that in there? Why would you do that? So the reason, of course, is models, even though they can be generic, they also can be quite specific to a view. So it doesn't pin you in to say that you have to share all models, you have to not share all views or controllers. You can pick and choose how it makes sense in your app. So generating a universal application will look surprisingly familiar if you've ever generated an app with command before. It's the same. And the reason is that we're changing all our app templates to be universal apps. So when you generate a command app, it will generate the structure we just saw. All of those pieces will be there, wired up, so you can just move in, start putting code where it belongs, and run a build, and you'll have an app that loads up. So basically, that's it. It's a universal app. But there is a new concept here with command. I don't know if anybody's used this, but we did blog about it, which is the notion of a build profile. So has anybody embarked on build profiles yet? Okay, several in the back. So in 5, it was largely used for theming, where you could have different builds. Our kitchen sink, which has 2 locales, multiple themes, you switch between the 2. We have upwards of a dozen build profiles in our kitchen sink example for that. So with a standard universal app, we'll start with a couple, and they're named after the toolkit that they select, but that can be any name you want. So you can have phone, tablet, desktop. You can have mobile, desktop. However it makes most sense to you, you can name them what you want. But within a build profile, you can tune it to whatever difference there is, a toolkit, a theme, locale, take your pick. But that's what it generates out of the box. So if you've used Command 5, you've noticed that we switched all of our 5 apps to the microloader. And so how many of you used the Sencha Touch microloader in the past? So a handful. Local storage caching, have you turned that off or left that on? Off? Okay, I know a lot of you, it's a mix, but with 6, we're basically bringing over all the functionality of the former Sencha Touch microloader. In 5, it did not do local storage caching. In 6, it can do that, and it can do delta patching for any build profile that you want. So there's a whole session from Ross Gerbasi on the microloader and how all of this comes together. So if you have to deal with interesting builds and you want to know more about it, there's a whole session on the microloader functionality. But that script tag is all we need in the markup file. Loads this bootstrap file, which is actually generated by command for you, and that contains the microloader and other necessary parts. So we'll see a little bit more about that later, but in-depth session on that later from Ross. So once you go to multiple builds, you have a bit of a question. It's like, when I land at this page as a user, what happens? I have to figure out how to boot my app. And so we have a function that you provide that's generated again in the starter app called before load. This is called before the framework loads, before anything in particular gets loaded. This is defined by your own script tag in the HTML file. And its job is to perhaps look at these tags, which are platform identification user agent detections, and make a decision about which build profile you want. Now, that can be based on a user preference. If you have users that say, I really hate your mobile app, I want your desktop app on my tablet, or the opposite, I want that tablet app on my desktop, you can make this a personal preference and fetch it from the server. It's up to you, but we need to know the name of that build profile by the time this function ends, and then the microloader kicks in and will load the rest of the app. So another common switch would be something like this. So you can say, I like phones to go modern, but tablets to go with classic. So we can change the criteria very simply or very not simply, query strings, whatever makes sense, again, for your app. This is approximately what we generate in our starter app, just to get you some ideas. So I guess most of you are probably developers. How many write apps all day? Just sit at the terminal writing code, working on apps. Okay, so probably the majority, not all of us, but it really matters how the development experience goes down, right? We don't want tooling to be involved in every single thing we do. So one of the things Command tries to do is give you a very streamlined dev experience. And it gives you a couple commands that are pretty helpful to that. So I'm going to go through a couple of those, and then we'll hit a demo. So this is our build profiles. And if you've been with Command for a bit, you've met AppWatch. It's now able to watch specific build profiles. So when you have a multi-build app, you can say, OK, well, I'm going to be tinkering and working on the styling of the classic portion. So I just want to launch watch against that. You can load it against modern. My arrow didn't line up. But you have to tell us which one you want to watch right now. That is a limitation. But if you're working on styling, as you saw, there are some other tools that come along the way that can help with that. But for watching your code changes, you just have to pick one of those to get it going. So that's probably the most productive tool that we have. It keeps it in the background, knows what you've changed. It knows that you added a resource, copy it to the resources folder. You've changed the SAS, tell the browser to reload that SAS. And if you're running with Fashion, that SAS can be reloaded without reloading the page. And there's a session on that from Phil Garant, so I recommend going to hear more about Fashion. Once it's in the browser, there's some magic we can do now, as they said, that doesn't require rebuild, reload, and relaunch. Of course, you can run builds, but I'd like to keep these to a minimum, of course, but we have a development build, which is the lightest weight build we can run just for development purposes. So it won't concatenate a single JavaScript file out. It won't compress it. It won't compress your CSS outputs. It just whatever was needed to load my index file from its normal location, just make that happen. And you can do this for either or both. That is now optional for this build, because if you don't say, it just does both. So if you know what you're doing, just this one, you can save a few cycles by picking, but otherwise it will get both of them ready to roll. And I should mention, when you're running AppWatch, it runs our internal web server. So if you are not using a web server like out of your dev environment that you have to use, we provide a basic file server. It doesn't do anything more than turn your file protocol into an HTTP protocol. And that's really helpful for getting around file protocol silliness around browsers. So when you're running AppWatch, we host your app with a URL, and we'll see that in a minute. So it hosts the whole app, but it's only monitoring half of it. The build here just, of course, gets the bits on disk for your own server, perhaps. So, all right, demo time. Let's see if we can do this live. Okay. All right, can you guys read this in the back? Yes, good. I can make the font bigger if I can find the mouse. I apologize, it's not mirroring the display, so I have to do this out of the corner of my eye. All right, I may give up on that unless someone tells me they can't see it. I don't know if that made it any better. All right, we're going to have to run. So I've generated a few of these, but we'll just keep going, generate another one. So that's the command that we've got. And if you're going to download the bits from the website, you'll want to do this, which enables access to the beta repo. You'll need the version of command that we give you in the download link to use that beta, because the evolution of the framework and the features of command are such that you need this version of the command app to run this. But basically, that beta switch enables the beta package repo and then we're going to generate an app, an EXT app in particular. Of course, it's universal, so I didn't say anything, and that's where it's going to go. And this is basically exactly what Jason Klein did in the keynote. So nothing surprising here. What we're going to do after this, though, is we're going to start loading it up, looking at some of the code, and see what's going on under the covers. So what's going on is it's generating all the code to disk, and then it's run SAS already. It's moved on to the modern toolkit. It's now generated and run through the SAS, and basically we're done. So we have development builds of both build profiles in place, and we could just run this if we had a local web server. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch in. So again, it doesn't matter which one I watch, the whole app is served at this point, and the URL will be displayed here. At the map, you can configure these things, but it's hosted on port 1841. And when it arrives at the waiting for changes, that's AppWatch's signal that it's not doing anything, and we know everything's stable. So let's bring the app. To a screen near you, if I can get it over there. Okay, so that is not the app we just generated. It's previous brother. So, okay, so there's our app. Now, this is, again, the new starter app from Command. We're going to work on building out a variety of starter apps to choose from, but this one, if you've seen our previous starter app, is a fair upgrade from the previous one. So this now is the debug tools. So I'm going to switch this into an iPad and hit reload. And if you recall, this was because my before load function decided that desktops were the only thing that got classic. Otherwise, we're going to use the modern toolkit, and then that's the app we got. And we've got our grid in here. Now, a couple of things that if you were watching before, you'll notice that the icons are the same. These are font awesome. That's included in the standard app that we generate. It's in the shared resource area. So those are an example of resources that are shareable across toolkits. If you build your own web fonts, obviously that's a good candidate for sharing. There's no reason to make 2 copies of those. So let's switch devices. I can find the mouse again. To, say, an iPhone. And load. Okay, and so there's our app, and if we roll, so there it is. That's the universal app, as you saw earlier, loading based on device profiles. So let's change it up a little bit. Do it on time. Let's change it up, bring the code into view here. Okay, so collapse that and that. Okay, so this is going to be hard. All right, I'm going to reduce the font. If anybody can't see it, I'll put it back up, but I need to be able to see it for a moment. All right, so this is the actual generated one, so let's flip it to base this on phone instead. Save it and flip back to the browser. Okay, I think I flipped to the debugger. Right, so this is the phone. Reload, of course, it's the same. But if we flip it to iPad, reload, now we're running classic. So again, you can decide how this works for your app and design the views based on the device that you're after. So what I'd like to look at next is a bit about how the code actually starts to take shape under here. The generated app tries to set you up to share as much as possible. So what we've generated in the app folder is a shared controller and a shared store. We have a personnel store. This is exactly the same code running on both toolkits, as is our application class. We share our view model, which has some data binding going. So lorem ipsum is a string in our view model. And our main controller is listening to item select, calls message confirm, does some things. So the difference between modern and classic in this app is down in the main view and the list view. So the main view, if you've done ext before, this looks probably familiar. It's going to look very similar on the modern side, but you were missing controllers and whatnot. And there's our list. And the list, also not shared, because again, the view is going to be something that's likely different between a phone and a desktop. So there's likely going to be differences even with the same toolkit in mind. But this one is picking a personnel store and sending, as you saw with the IDE plugin demo, it's sending the select event to the view controller and on item selected. And if I can click there, you can see that is on item selected. And there's the consequence of selecting an item. So we switch back, click this, and there's the confirmation coming from the view controller that was shared. And if we switch back to the phone, reload, and we select an item. So again, this is obviously different views, but shared controllers, shared stores, shared entry points to application. In a nutshell, that is the universal application. So we've saved a fair bit of time for Q&A, but I wanted to also talk through a couple of the alternatives to using command, because I know not everybody uses command. So of course, we do want to preserve that compatibility. It's your choice how you build your apps, pull the code together. We think command is helpful. If you are using command, but you don't want a universal app, you can do that. You can say, let's run it just classic. I don't want to worry about modern apps right now. So basically, what that looks like is starts with this, moves those out, moves in those, and in the end looks exactly like it did before. So if you're used to building apps with ext5, building them with 6, with the classic switch will be almost indistinguishable, slightly better starting point for an app, but basically the same. Modern app, similar. Starts with the universal, moves code in, takes code out. And again, it looks just like, very reminiscent of what a Sencha Touch app looked like. What's primarily different is that now that we're sharing the core, we have MVVM support, we have data binding, we have all of the things that are common to the core, multi-input support, those kinds of things that were lacking in Sencha Touch are not lacking in ext6 in the modern toolkit. So there's a lot more there than just what was in Touch, but it'll look very familiar. And the migration path will have a good set of docs around that, because there will be some issues around the shared core area primarily. And of course, the last piece is directly using builds for all. There are, of course, the standard xall debug, and a pair of new ones, xmodern all debug. So those would be, again, the superset beyond what was Sencha Touch all and Sencha Touch all debug. So those are full builds, minimized, compressed, and optimized, but it has 100% of the framework. And as I mentioned, the framework is large. That's a good thing that it is large, because you can use all that functionality. It's at your fingertips. But it's really can be a lot of code. If you don't need all the code, it's a wise move to look at making an app, structuring an app that lets you selectively pull only the pieces you need. And again, that selective pull is also styling. So for all toolkits, the styling comes in by name correspondence from Sass to JavaScript. So if you're not using grid, shame on you. But if you're not using it, it won't be in the build. Neither will it styling. So you won't have any of the CSS that goes with grid. Same deal. All right. So we tried to save a fair bit of time for Q&A because I suspect there will be quite a bit. So ask away, down on the floor. Do we have a mic for the questions?
You can move to the microphone over there.
Oh, there we go. That way everybody can hear, and we'll have it on the recording.
And my question is Command still going to support device native API and packaging?
Yeah, it still has Packager. We've even improved that a fair bit in 5. If you've used 5, so the support we have for native packaging, is still present. We integrate with PhoneGap, Cordova. It's very clean integration with it. We know how to put our build in the right place, how to invoke the right command from their point of view to produce the package. Absolutely supported. So, okay, over here. Is there a mic? Yep.
So now, as I understand it, you're going to use the whole framework of EXTJS and reduce it with commands so that it takes away everything you don't use and make it small enough to run on the phone.
So EXTJS now includes both toolkits, right? So the feature set that's the largest is possibly in the views that are on the classic toolkit side. So border layouts, the most advanced grid functionality, and all of that is on the classic toolkit side right now. And there's limited functionality, but growing on the modern side. So the idea is to select the code that you pick, starting with your app, work your way through your views and the controllers and those pieces and what they need, and give you that. So if you're using just modern, you're running on a phone, you're not going to have what you might think of as EXT coming from previous versions, because the lion's share of that code, if it's not in core, is in the toolkit.
So you're not expecting to have the complete application, if you rebuild it with this style of application, getting bigger in terms of end result for the JS file, including our program and the framework.
Bigger compared to some...
The Sencha Touch.
Sencha Touch. Well, there's obviously more functionality with MVVM and other things. So we're definitely going to be watching the file sizes, and there's a good session that's no longer secret from Modus Create folks about visualizing class dependencies. So the challenge, of course, is knowing why things are present and how to control the class inclusions. And so with the bigger core, more functionality, there is opportunity for things to come in. But we're absolutely focused on keeping the file size down and making sure with command that you get only what you need. So
what about the part about the SAS stuff, like the CSS? When you build, is that containing the whole shebang for both the desktop and
It's separate CSS file outputs. So for each of the build profiles, they'll have their own CSS file that is produced, which is only what that build profile needed. They'll have their own JS file produced, which is only what that build profile needed. And
so the microloader will basically select which...
That's correct. The microloader is the key that allows us to take what you need and know about it so early before anything else loads. We don't wait for the whole framework to load, then figure out what you actually need. Right.
Does that mean that Sencha Touch goes away?
Well, I'll let Gautam speak to that one. I suppose Q&A time. But Sencha Touch isn't going away. It's still there, still supported. We still have support contracts, and all those will be honored. But I'll let Gautam speak to that more.
We will no longer be adding any new features to support to Sencha Touch, but we will continue to support it and fulfill our support contracts.
Okay. Two last questions. The process of building...
Rotate to the back of the line if you wouldn't mind. We'll make sure we get everybody in.
Sorry, I think it's a bit of a duplicate of some of what he asked, but do you guys actually have any numbers for existing demo apps, for example, and then running the same thing with the minus classic just to see the code base size?
Versus like an all file, or versus version 5, or?
Versus 5.
Versus 5, we haven't got metrics on that at the moment. So we could easily test various examples and see file size. The primary changes in 6 have been accessibility, some features, but there's not been anywhere near the code motion that was in 5, which is why 4 to 5 was longer than 5 to 6, because the piece that needed to be brought together finally was the modern toolkit, Sencha Touch componentry on the core. So that's where most of the change has taken place. And but no, right now we don't have numbers, but it's a good question.
2 very quick questions. 1, does the grid support subgrouping? And 2, does version 6 leverage web workers in any way to offload CPU-intensive operations like grouping or sorting or whatnot?
Okay, so I'll answer the last question first. There's no use of web workers at the present time. It's an interesting approach. A lot of the times that stuff winds up going to the server to get processed, but remote summaries and things like that. Pivot Grid also supports remote aggregation. So there's a lot of offloading that can be done that way, but we haven't done web workers. And I'm not sure I got the first question very clearly.
Subgrouping in grids where you can
No, multi-level grouping?
Yeah.
We have a proof of concept, but nothing that we can put out right now. So I'd have to say no at the moment, but it's definitely been something we're playing with.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing.
So when you have a shared controller, and the shared controller needs to, execute some logic, but then it also needs to update the UI. Are there any special considerations or programming kind of patterns that you need to use? So, for example, in mobile, when you tap on a record, it might need to show a new, a slide up action sheet, or you might need to take some sort of action. Is there any additional consideration you have to do to the naming of your components or selectors that you put on components so that you can write shared code?
Right, so obviously with the simple case like we demoed here, we're glossing over the challenge that will be how do you share code in controller space, because with two different toolkits, they're not identical. They have different things and you have different experiences. So in a nutshell, I'd say the use of mix-ins and things like that would be helpful, because in the end you probably will want to have a controller for the modern and for the classic, and find either a base class or a mix-in as a way to take the shared logic that both have and use it in both, but still diverge without considerable, if I'm on this toolkit, do it this way. If I'm on this device, do it that way. So there's a combination of techniques that can be done. Mix-ins was a starter. Platform configs, we'd actually posted an article a couple months ago on platform configs, which are conditional expressions that allow you to turn on and off things based on platform queries. We went through it fairly quickly, but the platform tags that we saw at the beginning and before load are the same ones that you pick here. So it's a combination of things, but in the end, it's an art form and a balancing act to figure out what's shareable, what's not. Is the cost of sharing it worth it? And so I don't know if that fully answered your question.
No, I think it would be good to look at some examples and, showing people, here's an application, here's how it was done, where there was maximal sharing. Because there are some kind of tricks. I've actually had to do similar sorts of things.
Okay.
And it would be great to see, Sencha really think about it and provide some, the Sencha way of doing it, the best practice way of trying to share code between mobile and tablet and desktop. And
yeah, that's a great request. So as you've seen, we have a executive dashboard example. That one has a very mobile feel to it. It's obviously implemented with EXT 5, and as we move that to 6, we're going to make that a universal app and make sure that it has this split personality, and it will definitely be a good way to showcase at least some amount of sharing of code between those two personalities. We don't have too many other examples that come to mind, but that definitely is something we'll look at. Actually, the app template we're working on would be another case in point. The app template we have here is just kind of still very rudimentary, but we are, as you saw some screenshots, we're working on a much more robust app template for future release, or maybe this one. So
there's a session on a new app template that we're launching with this release, XJS, and that app template is a higher level abstraction, much kind of more from an app-centric point of view as opposed to kitchen sink, which is very component-centric. So we'll introduce that, and we'll continue to build more app templates.
Right, and they'll all be universal apps, trying to share as much as they can, show you how to build lists and things like that, and share as much as possible. So good request. And as we close the feature gap on the two sides, we definitely will be paying close attention to event names, event signatures, method signatures, as much as configs and their behavior, to make sure that as we add parity, that they're added in a compatible way, so that there's no gap there, and that will greatly simplify controllers. But if the UX is going to be different because it's a phone than because it's a desktop, that's going to be still something more app domain. So.
I'm back.
Hello?
I haven't heard a single word about the Sencha architect in the keynote presentation. Hopefully you're not dumping that. what's the plan? I heard that this is supposed to come out in June. Is that also a plan to come out with Architect that's going to be compatible with it?
Right. So we'll be releasing an early access version of EXT6 tonight. You'll all get an email, as well as the SenchaCon site will be updated with that. And the GA is expected to be around end of June. As far as Architect, we'll need some more time because there is major workflow changes required in Architect. If you think about Architect, it asks you to pick your framework first. And now with EXT, we have to change that paradigm. And that's why it's going to take longer. We typically release Architect updates within a month or month and a half. It might take 3 months this time.
Okay. Yeah. And is the plan to support the old Sencha Touch and the new universal app from the same architect, or are you also dumping the support of Sencha Touch from Architect?
So the current version of Architect will continue to support the current versions of the framework. But the new version of Architect might have to take out the support for previous, the two separate frameworks, because that Architect is going to rely on a single unified framework.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, okay, I have 3 questions. The first is real brief, and that is, do we have a unified approach for configs? And in Sencha Touch, you had to have config blocks most of the time. And so what's the recommendations there in EXT6?
Okay, I'll answer that one. If you have 2 others, we'll go through them. So configs, if you've used Sencha Touch, how many people use Sencha Touch and know a fair bit about configs? The role that they play in updaters, appliers, okay. So obviously in 5, that is part of the core, and we started using those in various places. Panels have configs and other things have configs. We tried to make sure it was compatible as possible, because with Sencha Touch config system, every storage property was underbar property name, but for historical reasons, that was never going to fly for EXT. It would make a huge migration problem. So, so we don't do that on the classic toolkit. We don't prefix it, but we do use it. And so that is definitely going forward and use it more and more where it makes sense. So where it makes sense is instance level configuration. So data package took it out, because models are class level configuration, not instance level configuration. And if you ever called init config from your model constructor, you'd find out just how wrong that was, because it would start applying your fields to your record and not to your class. So config is a way to describe things that will be processed per instance, and that's what we do with it. You have to wrap it in a config block to add a new config. You may not know this, but you can do that from an override now. So if you override a class, you can add a config to it that way, proper, fully working config. But to set a config, again for EXT historical reasons, that can be on the class body. So the panel title or the button click handler, whatever it is, if it's become a config in the config sense, it can still be declared on the class body. And the class processor knows, oh, that's a config, let's handle it the config way. And otherwise, it just goes as an applied onto the instance way. So that's generally the case. If you're adding a config, you have to wrap it to tell us it's a config. Deriving from it, you don't have to wrap it. You may, but if you have a typo, it will add a new typoed config for you. And if you don't, it's still going to be a problem, but in this case, it'll do less of a problem. So hopefully that's enough of an answer for that one.
Great, which leads to the question of migration from Sencha Touch apps and from EXT5 apps. It seems like EXT5 to EXT6 would be pretty straightforward. What about migration from Sencha Touch to EXT6?
So the primary change, of course, is at the core, because the core is the more reconciled one. So if you looked at from 4 to 5 on the EXT side, that was the biggest set of changes between the two. And how do I deal with the data package now that it's unified? What about the events and things? So that's going to be the same case now for upgrading from Sencha Touch to EXT6. Modern toolkit is the views are going to be very familiar, very similar. All the configs basically the same. The styling won't be radically different. If anything, we're going to improve the SAS API to be more variable laden, so you can set things more easily. But there's no major change to that stuff. There will definitely be a bump to get through it, but it won't be epic. So it depends on where you're at. But the core is where most of that will be.
Great. And last quick question. What about device profiles versus responsive config in EXT6?
All right. So the general role of those device profiles, they're still supported. We added them, in fact, to the core in 5. or 5.1, I forget now, but their role is for runtime consideration, primarily something, think iOS phones versus tablets. You might have just different view at the top that you want. So whenever you leave the realm of build profile, and you probably do that fairly quickly, you're going to have plenty of runtime choices, and app profiles give you a really good way to make those choices, as would a responsive config if the choices are more surgical. I want this docked left or top, or I want it to be rotated or not, or aligned left or centered. Fairly surgical choices. It's not a great choice for an app profile to make those little things happen. So that's when we added responsive configs, because it's our configs that govern the behavior. So we needed a way to connect those with the dynamic situation. So all of them are supported, and I think they all fit a particular purpose. And platform configs are the most recent, and they're more static. As the class loads or as the instance comes up, they're never going to change, but they may be still dynamic. So they all have their purpose. So.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Don. We're looking forward to rolling out Sencha Ext 6 training real soon.
All right.
Yeah, I also had a question about porting Ext JS 5 and Sencha Touch 2.4. That last question helped me, but can I put a request in that you put some best practice notes out there on how to actually go about porting your code across?
Oh, definitely. There'll be a whole guide on upgrading from Sencha Touch 2.4 to Ext 6 Modern Toolkit, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Blow for blow. If you've seen the Ext 5 upgrade guide from 4 to 5, it'll be like that. Lots and lots of things, class by class, events, methods, things that are different. Anything that's going to be an issue should wind up in that guide.
Cool. Sure. Okay, and also just include notes on what to do in Sencha Architect.
I'm sorry. What's that?
Sorry. No, you also include what specifically to do in Sencha Architect. So
yeah, as God mentioned, Architect is going to lag a bit on this one because the paradigm shift to multi-toolkit is fairly fundamental to how Architect thinks. And having two X.components and two X.panels in mind for a single application is quite a shift for it. And so I don't know the lag time, but it's definitely it's not coming out with the release, so that guide it'll basically say not compatible with Sencha Architect current release.
Yep.
And for that period of time, that'll be the case.
Cool. Okay.
But when it would be more of an architect timing question. How do you take an architect project
That's it. Yeah.
and bring it forward? So.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
When deciding how to share code between Sencha Touch and Ext JS, did you ever consider trying to come up with a component that's called, let's say, the meta grid, that you tell the meta grid for mobile, be a list, but for Ext JS for desktop, use the Sencha Ext JS grid, kind of one layer above, because what I see, having to create separate views in the views folder for the different platforms. Let's say if the only difference between these two screens from a high level is that one's a list and one's a grid, it seems like that's still very repetitive. If that's the only thing that's changing is the X type of the fact that it's an X type list and an X type grid.
Okay, it's a good question. We actually, and we're pretty much right out of time. I'll try and get to that, and then I'll be around for other questions. But the real challenge there of trying to make a UI abstraction layer, if you will, that abstracts it is that it's very hard to make choices when you pick, tablets or phones. It's a very simplified way to look at the problem. So sometimes it'll work, sometimes it wouldn't fit. And I think the thing that finally decided that we probably wouldn't pursue that approach for the foreseeable future was that it's not very hard for an app to take on something similar, because in your view folder, if you made your own derived class in the classic view folder and your own derived class in the modern view folder, now whatever adaptation is there is fairly small, and then you can use that as an X type or a base. And we do that actually with our charts package extensively. It is a cross toolkit piece of the puzzle, and it has bases that go off into the different toolkits. And that's how it approached it, is it just took a couple bases that they all needed, and they extended the appropriate toolkit bases, made a little adaptation, and then the lion's share of the code was cross toolkit at that point. So it was definitely something that was considered as quite difficult to achieve a satisfying, also, fits most cases. And so that's where we ended up with it. But if you have specific ideas, it would be good to hear them.
I was just curious if you could just give me an idea of the relative, this kind of been answered, but migrating from X4 to 5 versus 5 to 6, as far as how much work you might expect for an average application. Is it comparable?
It's quite a bit less because the core is the big change from 4 to 5, and that's the same basic core that we have in 6. So the move from 5 to 6 will be less than from 4 to 5.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure thing.
So IE 8, 9, and 10 is going away early next year. For version 6, the support have been already dropped, or you're planning to drop the support?
So the browser support for ext6 classic toolkit will be the same as ext5. So IE8 strict mode and better will be supported in 6. On the modern side, we haven't made all the final decisions on old Android and things like that.
Our customers,
I'm going to have to step off because the next folks are going to have to present, but
thank you.